Oh, hey, you may be wondering, where are you? Well, let me tell you. I'm standing at the entrance to Milwaukee's deep tunnels, which is a vital part of our sewer system. We haven't always had the deep tunnels, and they weren't fully operational until 1996. They have drastically helped reduce flooding, sewage overflow, and cleaning out our waterways. But how did they get here? Let me tell you. Milwaukee has had a long history of carelessness surrounding public health and water quality. For the first half of the 19th century, all of our waterways were one big dumping ground. Sewage, wastewater, horse manure, trash, and anything in between ran into our waterways. By the Industrial Revolution, things only got worse. Many of our waterways were unswimmable and unfishable. Yuck! By the 1900s, Milwaukee realized we needed to do something about our never-ending sewage problems. Long story short, over the next 50 years, Milwaukee did its best to keep up with its growing population, wastewater treatment, and sewage disposal. While it was slowly improving throughout the 1900s, we were nowhere near good. We needed to do something bigger. Bigger and better! 'Cause we sucked. We sucked really bad. Fast forward to 1972. This is when things started to change, not only for Milwaukee, but the United States as a whole. And that brings me to my exigence, and that is the Clean Water Act of 1972, which was later revised in 1977. The main thing was in 1972.
Okay, so this might be a little confusing, but I'm going to back up just a little bit to one day before the bill was put into place, and that's when President Nixon decided to veto the bill, claiming that the price tag was too high. It had appropriations over 3 years of $24 billion, and he was like, no ma'am, that is too much money, and decided to veto it. So at the time of the veto, he was actually going against the advice from the head of the EPA, William Ruckelshaus, who said in this quote, basically, he thought it was pretty reasonable to spend less than 1% of the national budget on saving the environment for future generations. So to give you some context for what was going on at the time of this veto, there was public outcry all over the country. Milwaukee was not the only city struggling at this time. We needed more regulations, more laws on pollution, more funding for projects that could save our environment, because there was environmental havoc everywhere. Some examples are in 1969, a river in Ohio was so tainted by industrial pollution that it caught fire a total of 13 times. That same year, an oil rig in Santa Barbara exploded and spilled more than 200,000 gallons of oil into the ocean. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, factories in a small town called Woburn, Massachusetts, were caught emptying industrial solvents upstream and onto their properties that contaminated the locals' water wells. And over time, that small town had a total of 21 children diagnosed with leukemia, 12 of them dying. And then also, pertaining to Milwaukee, in February of 1972, just 5 months before the Clean Water Act was passed, Milwaukee was sued by the state of Illinois for polluting Lake Michigan with an alleged 200 million gallons of raw, untreated sewage. This is a case that went all the way to the Supreme Court and was later decided on April 24th. And I want to bring that up because it's going to be important for a later part of my information cycle. But basically what I'm saying is, at this time, things were very bad, and the United States was in desperate need of change. And this was some legislation that finally seemed like it could be effective. So him vetoing this was a pretty big deal. So the immediate response to this veto was negative from many members of Congress, more specifically from Senator George McGovern, who called the president's veto a, quote, mean-spirited action by a president who has always put special interest before public interest, end quote. This quote, along with the statement made by Ruckelshaus, was published in a New York Times article the following day. The historical context of this article is noteworthy because Nixon was really showing his true colors with this decision to veto such an important bill. And I think the quote from McGovern really summarizes the flaw of American politics as we see them today, with kind of this cognitive dissonance of presidents. They have this whole campaign run on one thing, but then when it comes down to it, they really don't believe in doing said things. Nixon's campaign in the beginning focused a lot on environmental improvement. And this was kind of a slap in the face to a lot of people. Alright, so mere hours after this decision, the Senate took to the floor to overturn the veto, 52 to 12, 17 of the votes in favor of the override being Republican. So shortly before the vote, Senator Edmund Muskie, who was Democrat of Maine and the bill's main sponsor, gave a short speech on the environmental damage our country was facing. He spoke of the hazardous Potomac River, which was contaminated with millions of gallons of sewage, factories discharging pounds of mercury into the Detroit River daily, fish dying in Florida bays, oil spills, and more. He later reiterated a quote that he'd made when the Senate initially passed the bill, which said, "Can we afford clean water? Can we afford rivers and lakes and streams and oceans which continue to make life possible on this planet? Can we afford life itself? Those questions were never asked as we destroyed the waters of our nation, and they deserve no answers as we finally move to restore and renew them." So, for some context of who this man was, he was no stranger to stressing his environmental concerns. He promoted the 1960s environmental movement and was one of the main sponsors of both the Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act, and later even earned the nickname Mr. Clean for his decades of work on environmental legislation. And this affected the way that he crafted his words because not only did he know what he was talking about, but was outwardly passionate about it, and he cared deeply for the environment, and you can really feel that through the way that he gave this speech. And he created this stark contrast between President Nixon, where money seemed to be more of the main concern rather than the literal future of our planet. And I really do think that people like Muskie were crucial to this operation and getting the bill passed. So the following day, the House swept the floor with a 247 to 23 override of the veto, 96 of those yes votes coming from Republicans, officially putting the Clean Water Act of 1972 into action. And this was big news. This was the most comprehensive legislation and largest budget Congress had approved for environmental cleanup. So the purpose of the Clean Water Act, as mentioned before, was to revise the 1948 Water Pollution Control Amendments in hopes of turning our water pollution crisis around for real this time. And I say that because the 1948 Act was basically ineffective. It had a set of comprehensive water quality programs and provided some state and local government funding, but was not well designed and did little to actually prevent pollution. The previous legislation did not specifically prohibit certain polluting activities or set any real standards, and it had particularly little to no regulation on point source pollution, which is pollutants from discrete conveyances such as a discharge pipe and are regulated by federal and state agencies according to watereducation.org. So essentially, the first act had a lot of loopholes and established little control over water contained within each state, and it didn't really do much to stop any pollution. So this affected how Congress rewrote the act entirely. Since the previous act was pretty much a failure, this legislation needed to be way more effective. So it was written in a way that would assure adequate protection and raise the stakes when it came to pollution. They dramatically tightened up restrictions and regulations regarding waste disposal and point source pollution, and increased water quality standards overall, and provided meaningful funding and resources for water treatment management and programs all over the country. So the weeks that followed the passing of this bill was a flood of news articles written on the topic, more specifically with the headlines of Nixon's controversial move to veto the bill. Even though the bill did in fact pass both the House and the Senate, no one could really ignore the fact that he opposed the legislation. This particular article under the editor's mail section in a local Waukesha newspaper was written just a few weeks after the override to pass the bill. I think it's a good look at a local stakeholder's opinion on the matter and highlights some important issues regarding Nixon's veto and public perception of him. And I think it's important to note the stakeholders in this situation because it's a really broad span of people. I mean, just going off of this letter to the editor, this person brings up Ruckelshaus and how they urged Nixon to sign the bill, and then later goes on to say that his veto revealed the president's constantly reiterated concern for pollution was conceived in deceit. The veto represented the views of great corporation polluters of our environment. So that's another stakeholder too that may have differing opinions on the bill. Anyone who was a big CEO of a large company or people within large corporations, they may have not have wanted this bill to pass because that means that they couldn't as easily dump their pollution anywhere they wanted anymore because the stakes were higher and they would get in trouble for it. Some other stakeholders might include local government and government employees, industry representatives, landowners, farmers. It could also include fishers and boaters and anybody who wanted to use our water recreationally. This also might include the people that were involved in the 1960s environmentalist movement, or any environmentalist at that point, because this was the biggest legislation passed for environmental cleanup. So this was a really big deal to a lot of people. So a few months go by after the veto and the override, and it's made public that Nixon is refusing to spend the money appropriated by Congress. He actually had the budget made for water treatment plans. This use of presidential powers was later challenged in the Supreme Court, Train v. City of New York, in which the court ruled that a president had no authority to withhold funds provided by Congress in the Clean Water Act of 1972. The president cannot frustrate the will of Congress by killing a program through impoundment. So this article was written for the Daily Register in Illinois, December 8th, 1972, and goes into some more of the breakdowns of the appropriations. It highlights the magnitude of the water problem in Illinois specifically, and how they're going to need a lot more money to fix the issues than the president was granting them. The writer of this article is not biased, but more so goes over the finer breakdowns of the money as to inform the public of the actual numbers and how they're working, along with estimations of just how much it would actually take to fix the issues at hand. And it was written like this to give context to Nixon's actions against them, and then from this you can form your own opinions on if you agree or disagree.
I'm going to switch the focus back to Milwaukee for a second, because I believe the Clean Water Act gave Milwaukee its final big push to do something about our problems with pollution. So remember what I said about that lawsuit between Illinois and the city of Milwaukee? By 1977, we had reached an agreement with the DNR to reduce overflows. This, plus the lawsuit, plus the Clean Waters Act, gave Milwaukee its final big push to do something big about our water problem. And that issue was resolved by the creation of the WPAP, also known as the Water Pollution Abatement Program, which was crucial in the development of the deep tunnels. And by 1982, after years of planning and public input, MMSD began construction on the tunnels, which ended in 1992.
An article from PMI.org goes over the main goals of the program. And this program has historical significance because it just goes to show how much was made possible through the Water Pollution Act of 1972. Everything the WPAP aimed to achieve was highlighted in the act itself. It's important to recognize this because without the act getting passed, the WPAP likely wouldn't exist at all, thus never creating the deep tunnels, so on and so forth.
Decades after our deep tunnels have been built, Milwaukee has seen massive improvements, not only in water quality, but property value and infrastructure in the surrounding riverfront and lakefront areas. The river! We're at the river! The River Walk. Milwaukee's Journal-Sentinel has a story published by reporter Tom Dakin, who wrote, "The total fair market value of the riverfront properties between North Avenue and the Milwaukee Harbor increased by nearly 150% from 2001 to 2013. That added more than $520 million in value. The Riverwalk was built in 1993, but couldn't have been done if our rivers hadn't been cleaned out. And the number one factor in changing that, as concluded by Don Bellm, a Journal-Sentinel environmental reporter, was the building of the deep tunnels. So you can thank the deep tunnels for how awesome our riverfront walk is. That's this, right here. This is such a cool river walk, don't you think? I love walking on our river walk. I walk here every day, and I notice how clean our water is. Okay, it's a lot cleaner than it was before. It's not perfect, but yeah, the river walk is enjoyed by many. It's a new addition to Milwaukee. Well, it's almost like 30 years old at this point, but that's pretty new in terms of Milwaukee's water history.
So these articles would circulate to any Milwaukee local, pertaining more specifically to those who live close to the water, but anyone who lives in Milwaukee would probably be interested. The Milwaukee Journal Sentinel can be accessed online, on any mobile device, and through printed newspapers. I think these articles provide a nice boost for Milwaukee citizens because it shares future plans and current successes that our city is accomplishing, and things can only really get better from here, at least hopefully. The Riverwalk is just one of many examples of how our cleaner waterways have drastically improved our city.
So, Milwaukee has made drastic improvements over the past decade, as well as the United States as a whole, but we still have a long way to go. For now, just be glad that our rivers don't smell like waste and Bradford Beach is open to the public, as well as being thankful for our deep water tunnels, which is actually used as a model for many other states for being a state-of-the-art sewer system. So yeah, just clean up after yourself and be kind to the environment because it's important and we still have a long way to go. Thank you for listening to me. The EPA, Clean Water Act, President Nixon, controversial figure, but the Clean Water Act that he vetoed. That's it. I don't know what else to say.